Why don't you come up then? I can hear you. Why don't you come up then? Thank you. So good morning and welcome to this work session on public records and open meetings training. Today is the 28th of April. It is 10:03 a.m. We'll go ahead and do introductions. Start with Ms. Bronga.
Karen Bronga, District 5.
Anna Brawley, District 3.
Scott Myers, District 2.
Zach Johnson.
Christopher Constant.
George Martinez.
And from the legal department, we have,
Matthew Hurt, Legislative Counsel.
I should say the Assembly Council and Legal Department, but. And
Yeah, you know, I call us the Assembly Council's office or the Legislative Council is title. I think that sounds great.
so back in the
Anyway,
back of the room, we have.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Introductions.
Yeah.
Dean Gates, Assembly Council.
Thanks, Dean. In the back of the room, we have Jamie Hines, one of our acting clerks and elections coordinator. We have the ombudsman, and we have one of our municipal attorneys and our legislative communications staff. And from there, why don't you go ahead and take it away, gentlemen?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, my name is Matthew Hurt. I'm the Legislative Counsel. I work with Dean Gates in the Assembly Council's office this morning. We're going to be talking to you about public records, and I actually am going to ask Jessica Willoughby to come up and chime in if she's comfortable doing so, because she was on a slide yesterday with the Department of Law, and she was their public records go-to person. And so she and I have been working a lot together on some recent issues, so I wanted to invite her up, whether or not she wanted to be. Okay. All right. So we're going to be discussing public records. I'll be discussing public records first, and then we'll go over to Dean, who will discuss Open Meetings Act. And this is, I know everybody's favorite topic is law, and talking about it first thing in the morning, I understand, is everybody's favorite time to talk about it. So if you can take your enthusiasm down a couple of notches, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. All right. So that was supposed to be sarcasm, and it's not playing. That's all right.
It's too early for that.
It's too early for sarcasm. All right. All right. So public records. I did put this up as my attention getter because I used to teach college kids, and you need an attention getter. And now that I've broken the ice, you should be ready to relearn. But there actually is a lot of truth to that.
One sec. And we also are joined by Mr. Salt. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. There's a lot of truth to this, even though it is meant for humorous purposes. It isn't stalking if it's a public record, and you're about to have more documents in close proximity to you that are now public records than you're probably accustomed to. And it may be a shock to your system. In fact, I would be surprised if it's not, because a lot of the things that you deal with on your daily life with your personal businesses or what you did prior to becoming an assembly member were entirely your business, unless you got sued or something like that, and then there was a discovery process. But you had a reasonable expectation of privacy in a lot of the things that you put your hands on. As a public official, your reasonable expectation of privacy has gotten a lot narrower. And so the things that you deal with on a daily basis are going to be subject to public records requests a lot more frequently and a lot more broadly than you may anticipate. So that's the purpose of today's training. The authorities we're going to be dealing with today, we're going to primarily discuss the definitions in Chapter 390 and the Anchorage Municipal Code. Also, the Alaska Public Records Act, which is Alaska Statute Chapter 425, also applies. And then there's plenty of case law on this subject. More to be made soon, I'm sure. So the main reason I put this up there, you can go look at the code and get the definition. But the main thing that I put this up there for is to just show that it's a broad definition of what we consider a public record. And the default position of the municipality is to side with disclosure. Generally, if we have a document, we consider it to be a public record unless it fits into an exception. So if you think about it in terms of burden of proof, the assumption is disclose. The burden of proof is on us as the municipality, or us as the assembly in our case, to show why it should not be disclosed. And there are some narrowly tailored exceptions within the code, also within the Alaska statutes. But unless it fits into one of those and you have a strong argument for fitting into one of those, it's probably going to be disclosed. The definition of record: any document, whether in draft or final form, containing information relating to the conduct of the people's business, which is prepared, owned, used, or retained in a municipal agency or an agency under contract to the municipality, regardless of the physical form of the characteristic of that document. So what that means is you can fit just about everything into that definition, right? Hence the assumption that it's going to be public, it's going to be disclosable unless it fits into one of the narrowly tailored exceptions. For us as the assembly, those exceptions largely fall into things that are attorney-client privileged. There is some argument that there is some deliberative process privilege stuff that we have that in order to provide you freedom as legislators should not be public so that you can openly debate policies and decisions. That's largely more to the executive, but it does apply to us in the legislative branch to a lesser extent. But just assume if it's in writing, if it's on your laptop, it's probably going to be a public record. Okay.
Caveat being if it's about municipal business.
If it's about municipal business. But I'm lawyer, I'm going to be conservative, right? If you're doing municipal business, we're going to try to do it on municipal machinery in your municipal accounts, right? Like your Anchorage.gov account, AnchorageAK.gov account. That's where you need to be conducting municipal business. We'll get to emails in a second because that's a hot topic. So try to avoid doing things in your personal email or personal electronic devices. Again, similarly broad definition of the Alaska Public Records Act, regardless of form, if it's dealing with people's business, if it's official business as an assembly member, it's going to probably be considered a public record.
Real quick to put my caveat on my caveat is that we were having a discussion yesterday, Scott and I, and his real estate records for his clients and transactions on his machine that he might have assembly records on are not going to be subject to disclosure. That's kind of
You're right. Yeah,
the narrowing. I was
absolutely,
thinking
yeah.
not that there are incidents where you're using your machine to have public work on it, that those are likely.
Right. And this is where it starts to get broad. So examples that are in the code, and it's as it says, things that are considered public records are not limited to. So it's a non-exclusive list. But handwritten written notes, if you're given something in an open session, like we have documents out there for the public, if we email you something, generally that's going to be considered a public record. Anything in your official email, any official business you're conducting in your personal email. Really famous within Alaska Circle's case of McLeod v. Parnell, where the governor's administration was alleged to be doing a lot of official business via personal email. The allegation was that it was being done to avoid the Alaska Public Records Act, or at least that was the implication. But the court basically found that, look, if you're doing official business, it doesn't matter if it's in personal email or not. So if I'm on matthew.hurt@gmail and I'm doing official business on that, that document still retains its character as a public record and should be treated as such. All right. And they have this really broad definition in there as sort of that catch-all. It's like, it doesn't have to be, in a particular form to be a public record. It just needs to be appropriate for retention as a public record. So there is a level of discretion on your part in looking at things like, well, is this, the kind of thing that reflects the business of government? Does it reflect our deliberative process? Does it reflect how we do things? Or is this information that needs to be retained for future generations? It's a lot of questions to ask about email, and probably more than people usually do. But that's kind of how you need to treat things going forward. You really need to be conscious of not, we frequently use the phrase, I can't remember what phrase we use. You don't want to muddy the waters, right? You don't want to cross-contaminate. Keep your personal life personal. Keep your public life public. All right. The process that we use, and I don't know, did the clerk go? Yes.
Oh, I had just a question. So for example, if somebody's trying to reach me for assembly business and they have my personal email, so they happen to send it there, what's the best protocol for that? Would you recommend?
So, I mean, you could forward it to your official email just so it's retained there. That would be a good practice. I mean, if it's just like hey, are you coming to the assembly meeting today, or are you going to phone it in? That's the kind of stuff that it's like, you don't want to reach the point of like, I'm going to save everything that I've got and I'm going to buy it, external hard drive to save that kind of I don't want to say administrative, but like daily procedural stuff. of just like the nuts and bolts. I don't know that that necessarily is that important to retain.
Okay, I'm thinking more like a constituent or somebody.
So in
Yeah.
practical matters, everyone has their own process for doing that. Some people leave it there. If it's germane, will reply to them and reply to my municipal email. And then from there, delete the email on my private account and then reply from the public email to the person. It's kind of a lot, but that's my method, and everyone's is a little bit different.
I think that's probably a good practice. I don't know if Jessica, you have any thoughts on that.
It has not come up in my office that much, but I think we would recommend something similar. I'm always recommending to departments to adopt best practices early on, whether that means talking to people who work within Open Meetings Act for the past how many years. But there's, the law gives us kind of an outline, but obviously the day-to-day, it's 2023, not 1980, not 1970. Our records are looking different than when this was originally written. So best practices to ensure you're capturing the meat and the substance. Thank you. I recommend best practices, adopting them early and being consistent.
So I just have to say though, Jessica, you just did a classic thing. You said adopt best practices without saying what are the best practices or how to find the best practices. And so there's a conversation to be had for individual members to figure out how to find what those practices are.
Absolutely, because every department, every division in the municipality, we're talking local government, we're talking state government, are dealing with different types of records and different types of exemption issues, right? APD is going to be dealing with vastly different exemption issues than the assembly is. And I imagine you're going to see the same exemption issues come up. So that's why it's so tricky to nail down the best practices.
I would just put a coda on that there have been many discussions and will be more future discussions on the topic. And we are slow to act in adopting recommendations or policies.
If I could add, regarding best practices, I think sometimes things are not clear. Should this be a public record or is this privileged or anything? And I think just in light of the policies that there are at state and municipal level, that you should assume to err on the side that it's going to be a public record and disclosable. So unless you got some clear exception, so if it's vague and uncertainty, and that's really how courts will interpret this, we're going to err on the side of disclosure. So, or being a disclosable public record. And with that in mind, I think our practices sort of guide themselves.
Can I jump in one more thought? So an example of a best practice, and actually state regulations have different requirements about notice they have to provide to the public on forms and information the public is providing. So if you go on the state website for the governor and you want to give the governor comments, the governor's going to have a disclaimer on his comment website. This may be a public record. If there's a reason why you do not think this is a public record, give us that reason, or send something more anonymously via snail mail. I mean, that's literally what it says. And that's not in our law. That's a best practice that they've adopted to put folks on notice. The state has more notice requirements. We have less notice requirements. But one of those best practices is to, like, email disclaimers. I think the clerk's office has adopted this at the bottom. Instead of disclaiming that this is confidential, this is privileged, they go the other direction and they say, this is likely a public record. To put folks on notice that you're emailing with a government entity who has public records requirements.
I thought of one
Go ahead,
more
Emma.
question. And not to belabor, I know there's probably a million cases we could come up with or examples, but another one that comes to mind is HIPAA and personal or protected health information. So, obviously that's not something we should be disclosing of other people, but let's say a constituent emails or maybe sends to the full assembly public comment email and provides, detailed explanation of their prescriptions or pharmacy prescriptions or things. What obligation do we have if we're responding to them or?
I mean, obligation. I mean, they've pretty much waived it if they put it in there. And HIPAA really mostly pertains to doctors and insurance providers. Like if once that information gets out of that kind of closed circuit, it's really kind of the genie's kind of out of its box. Now, legally, I don't think you're obligated to treat it a certain way. I can't say that's necessarily a good idea, right? Like I think people are people, and they may not appreciate the they may not have benefited from a class on the Public Records Act. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know that you would necessarily want to dwell on that or keep putting that out, but I mean, once it's in there, it's kind of in there.
And, you know, the most difficult and awful example I can recall in my service, we had an individual woman come up, and it was it was in relationship to a conversation about sexual assault and domestic violence. And this woman told us she was going to tell a personal story. And Suzanne, as chair, said, please think carefully. This is a public record. It will be here forever. And she went ahead anyways. And then afterwards she wrote, oh my God, is there any way I can have that removed? Please help me. And the answer was, we're sorry, we don't edit these videos. We can't, it's against the law. And so people are able to give us whatever information they want. What we do with it is our call, but we can't delete those records once they're sent in. But you don't have to forward them.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and it was, I worked with a state regulatory board, and they were very careful about redacting PHI when they published it. So that's why I just wondered if that's different.
Yeah, so PI and PII, I think when we get, as assembly members, you generally won't have a lot of access to that. That tends to come up more, I think, when the clerk gets a public records request. But yeah, again, when in doubt, run it by us. And did the clerk talk about the public records process with y'all yesterday? Okay. Okay. There will. So I was going to walk you through it. I mean, there may be some animations involved, but like the way it generally goes is that we have a requester who will send a request to the clerk for a public record, and it will be like any documents pertaining to the passage of this code, or any public records pertaining to this particular assembly meeting or whatever. The clerk then takes that and sends it to the appropriate custodian of records. Maybe the assembly members themselves, and this is typically how you will get it. You will get an email from us being like, hey, we need any notes you took or anything, anything pertaining to this specific request. A lot of the times it goes to IT for emails. Who else do you usually have to touch base with? Sorry.
Right. If we get a request for your emails, we can put in a request to the OIT department to do what we call a preliminary search. And usually we will work with the requester to agree upon some search parameters, date, keywords, accounts, that sort of thing. That preliminary search gives us a rough guesstimate of how many records we're talking about, which will allow us to do a cost estimate to the requester to fulfill the request. So that's the first step.
Yeah. And what's the rate that they generally pay?
Not enough. It doesn't pay for attorney time. It only
That's true.
pays for a little bit of screening. It's $40 an hour.
It's $40 an hour for records retrieval, and
At most $40 an hour, depending on the rate of the person who's processing the records.
Yeah. So the request will then go to the custodian. The custodian will respond back to the clerk with the responsive records. A lot of the times it will then come to, we're back. It will come to us where we will then look at it, particularly emails. There's a lot of times there may be something that's attorney-client privileged in there, or there may be some other material that's not appropriate for disclosure under one of the exceptions in code or statute. We'll go through it, give it the thumbs up, and then it goes back to the clerk, and the clerk gives it to the requester. And that's generally how it happens. So don't be surprised if you get contacted by the clerk regarding any particular records pertaining to some piece of legislation. It can be a very time consuming process, but hopefully for you, it won't be that much.
Matthew, could I make one clarification on the very last step? Over the last many months, we've developed a process where Assembly Counsel's office is releasing the records after your review.
Okay. Then I take it back.
And then after that, there's a whole other bunch of things that could happen depending. And
That's when the magic happens.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the $40 an hour. Who is the requester paying that? Okay.
Oh, and our state law and code allows us to ask for that payment before doing the work. So we have an estimate process first, as that preliminary portion.
And one other thing to add, oh, sorry. It is our policy if it's going to take us less than an hour to get the record and release it, that we don't charge.
And what I was going to ask to say is some requests are very specific and very narrow. Can I get an email about this one document on this date? It's like, sure, maybe that will just take you 5 minutes and forward to the requester. And so we may not need to go through this whole process, but then we have requests. Can I get all emails between all members from July 1st to January and stuff? It's like, whoa, that's going to take a while. We do an estimate and maybe take a while to get to the requester.
Okay. All right. Now the much promised social media slides. So we did talk about this with like internet with Twitter and Facebook when we kind of touched on it, and kind of the acid test for this is it depends on whether or not you're making your social media presence a public forum. All right. And has anybody touched on this yet, or is this all right? Cool. I flagged it the other day. Good. I just want to make sure. So you are still have a right to a private online presence to an extent, even though you are public officials. If you do have a Twitter account, if you do have a Facebook account, things like that, it needs to be clear to the public that you're either out there in your private capacity as an individual. And this is an emerging area of case law. This is going up in front of the Supreme Court. We're about to find out how they're going to shake it out. But as of right now, the landscape really is if you are using it to engage with the public on official business on behalf of the municipality. If you identify yourself as an assembly member, if you're talking about matters that go out, that come before the body, if you are announcing things, policy changes, things like that, then it's starting to look a public forum, and you're starting to invite people to comment and engage with their government on your Twitter feed or on your Facebook account. If you're not doing that, right, then you have a much stronger argument that this is just Matthew Hurt in his private capacity on Twitter doing his funny movie quotes, personal musings, and passing on the latest cat videos, right? I know you're all very socially minded people, otherwise you wouldn't be in this position. So there is a tendency for, things to blur. I think it's probably okay to comment on large scale social issues, things that maybe not necessarily are coming in front of the government. But you just need to know that you're assuming a little more risk. The more political your personal account becomes, the more it's starting to look like a public forum. When it becomes a public forum by designation, that's okay. There are just different rules that apply. And this is kind of what I was talking about, right? Are you identifying yourself by position? Are you saying, Matthew Hurt Assembly Council, and then it's picture me in a suit in front of City Hall? Well, it's probably an official account, right? And then the other things I was talking about that make it look like you as an assembly member are engaging with the public. If you make it a public forum by designation, then you are subject to much stricter scrutiny anytime you discriminate based on viewpoint, subject matter, ban someone from your Twitter account, unfriend someone from your social media, or don't let them follow you anymore, right? Because you are officially kicking a member of the public out of a public forum, right? Which is a place that you essentially created to engage in public debate. So unpopular opinions are okay there, right? Offensive opinions are okay there. What you can do is create reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And that's the kind of stuff that we have when we that's the kind of things that the chair announces when he talks about how we ask people to engage at assembly meetings, right? Like, please, refrain from ad hominem attacks, threats on people's lives, trying to incite violence. Those things are not protected speech. That's not okay. So if you are going to have an official Twitter account as an assembly member or an official Facebook account as an assembly member, reasonable restrictions on that need to be posted so that people know, so it doesn't look like you're arbitrarily and capriciously kicking people off. And they're not going to be as broad as you'd probably like them to be. People are going to be allowed to disagree with you in ways that you probably don't like, but that's okay. That's what the First Amendment's all about. So if you want to maintain an official online presence in that capacity, talk with us and we can talk about kind of the rules that you need to post on up front so that people are on notice of what the appropriate way to engage in that public forum. And yeah, I mean, if I had my druthers, none of you would be on social media, but then you probably wouldn't have gotten elected. I'm a man out of time. Yes, please.
I just wanted to share a best practice that some of the municipal departments use. They put their policy in the about section saying we reserve the right to remove content that, and I think I could provide that. I think we have it written somewhere, content that is hateful or whatever is not allowed. And then the practice is if you do remove someone or remove a comment, you take a screenshot of it so you have that for backup, and then you send them a message with the screenshot and with the policy, and then you save all of that in your records. So that's not officially what you should do, but that is the practice that other departments use. So you know that process.
That was clear.
Yeah, thanks, Claire.
Mr. Gates.
I would just like to add one thing, and in applying that kind of practice, I think it's really important to have some warnings first, and not some automatic and jump to the end and boot someone, or like she said, take a screenshot, give a warning. This complies in a lot of contexts, like in our meetings at the assembly with public testimony. Someone's like off topic, they get a warning from the chair, or maybe 2 or 3 before there's actually like you're disrupting our meeting by not following the instructions and the rules that have been provided to you. So anyways, watch it up and don't just jump to the end.
Anna.
Yeah, thank you. And I think probably I would just like to have a follow-up conversation just to get more detail, but generally 2 questions. One, could you talk about, so there's blocking and then there's things like muting, or I think on Facebook there's hiding accounts, and are those, how are those treated differently? Because muting is basically where you're opting out to see people's comments, but you're not restricting them from making the comments.
Right. And I think I've seen that incorporated into that sort of that escalating response.
Okay.
Right. Like the first offense you get muted, and the second offense you get suspended, and then or whatever. Right.
There's really a practical reality there, though, that no one outside of you will know if they're muted. And so there's no issue. If you are not mandated to respond to somebody who has made an awful comment.
Right.
And so the muting is just a step in that process. So that may be litigated, but how are they going to know?
Yeah.
Unless you say, I muted this person, then that might become an issue. But
Okay. So it's a matter of whether you're actively removing or hiding somebody's comment versus letting it stand but not engaging with it.
well, it's that. And then the matter of, are you using it for public business? Is it a public page? Right. There's 2 different
Right.
things there. And all of that's.
Yeah. And the other thing I will say is if you are using it for official purposes, then you need to have a separate account for campaigning, right? When 3 years is up and we're looking to come back. Yes.
The other day I asked a question, and I'll flag it again. Is there a difference between a commentless broadcast, a blog essentially, or like a uniformed approach to that?
I can tell you that the practices are being at the legislature right now. Their guidance to members has been the only way you can cultivate comments. I shouldn't say cultivate. The only way you can not allow comments is by not allowing them for anybody.
For anybody, right.
If it's universal, then it's not a problem.
Okay.
But yeah.
So there's, if it's universal.
Because you, just an example would be, you can choose to turn off all comments on like Twitter and just have it as a broadcast mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably, I think you'd probably be all right. And like I said, this is all getting hashed out in front of the Supreme Court. So this is all going to change in 6 months anyways. So, stand by, more to follow. But yeah, I mean, when we issue press releases from the official website, it's not like there's a comment section for every press release, right? Now, when it goes on Twitter, then it might have a comment section there. So if you just want to disallow all comments from everybody from your Twitter account, I think that would probably be okay. But like I said, we're starting to get in the gray, and then I'm gonna have to think about that, or it depends area.
And
which
I
is-
recommend you have, when you get the chance, reach out to legislative legal and get
Yeah.
their advice that they're giving to legislators.
Yeah.
State law, they have a lot of attorneys and
Yeah.
they've probably got a pretty good basis. So it'd be nice to hear the policy.
Yeah. Jessica, you want to jump in on that?
I think part of the heavy lift of public records is that it's so case by case.
Yeah.
And it's so fact specific that the analyses that we're working on are just so dependent. Like that idea of turning comments off of like, well, you go back to the what tools we have to analyze that. You go back to the Supreme Court analysis of First Amendment of like forum and is this time and place restriction or is this a viewpoint discriminate? Like they're just really complicated analysis to apply across the board to something like Twitter, which like Matthew said is being looked at. So case by case, and keep in mind the idea of public records, you know, it's to provide liberal, broad access to folks is transparency. And those I think are the safest guidelines to ensure that folks aren't getting targeted, that folks aren't being punished for their viewpoints, because you're kind of shifting from public records requirements into First Amendment forum issues. And equal protection.
Sorry, I had one other question. Chris. So thinking also about the flip side of that, a private account. So I'll use, I guess, an example. So I set up an official assembly page, Facebook page, public, you know, and I totally understand all the risk with that, and then it needs to be used for that. I also have a private, or it's not currently private, but I have a personal Facebook account, which I know you can set to friends only, not discoverable, or not discoverable online, not legally discoverable.
Right. Yeah, I know what you mean.
And then let's say somebody was harassing me 6 months from now. Is that a situation where on just the personal account, like they're trying to do that, there's no political activity on that account? Is that something where somebody could be blocked or?
Yeah, I think
they're
that's
separate.
especially if you've got two, and then it makes the delineation very clear, right?
Yeah,
Then-
because I'm thinking family pictures,
Yeah,
or
100%.
things that are
I'm
not
putting my
official.
kids' pics up there. Like, yeah, I think you're in much stronger position to block somebody from that. And
Okay.
to,
Or at
yeah,
least exclude them from being.
100%. Yeah, because it's not official business.
Okay, thank you.
It's-
So I think also advice along those lines is as you'll get requests from your political side to your personal side, turn those down or redirect them. Otherwise, they'll just muddy the waters. If you have people that you're not sure, are they a friend or are they send them over to the other one? And I think maybe another thing to talk about is, and I know I've done it by mistake before, but you'll get projects that'll come up in your district that are a good project, another soccer field, and you're personally for that. And don't send your letter of endorsement from your Muni account. You can, I understand, freedom of speech, but it's recommended make sure you pull that out and go personal as well.
I don't know about that. I think you have letterhead access. It doesn't say the assembly, but it'll say the member. You're free to communicate on that what you want. You can't speak on behalf of the assembly, and you can send it. I support this project, this soccer field in my neighborhood because it's going to do a lot of good. And that's a fine use of your municipal email and your letterhead.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You might get a call from planning and they might throw out that recommendation. So I've had that call before.
Interesting. Yeah, there are some things to say about what's coming before the body. Being careful how you express yourself before the item is before us, because it could give the perception you've already made a conclusion. And but these are more subjective issues, not related to this. But it's an interesting area of inquiry.
Yes, ma'am.
So I may have to fix something real quick, but so I had a campaign page that was pretty, just neutral. And I just changed the name last night to Karen Bronga Assembly Person or something such.
And it's the same.
It's the same
handle on Twitter.
content.
And
Don't do that. Oh, it's fine.
yeah.
What you don't do is then turn it back
Right.
to a campaign page in 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That's where you're going to run into the issue. Although some people do that, and it's certainly a gray area. But because people have come to that place for your official position, you don't. But going from this is my campaign page to this is my official page, when you were campaigning, you weren't an official. Now you are. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, the real concern, I think, and that's what Chris is addressing, is that you are campaigning from an official position and using what you've now made a public forum as an official assembly member for your, don't flip it back. But yeah, the whole thing's fraught.
So, yeah, I was just telling Anna, the reason I did that is because it took a while to build up people to find me. And so I wanted them now to be fully engaged, and it's public. So, okay.
I would just add that sometimes convenience is sort of efficient and so forth, but it's better to take a little extra work to do some better practice, like in this case. So some of the case law that we were reading about social media involves people who campaign and then just converted it to their official position, web page or social media account after they were elected. So anyways, convenience is often I want to make a quote, but I can't remember it exactly. So always administrative convenience is one thing to consider, but also best practice and how to sort of segregate and avoid legal issues is another side. Sometimes that just means not taking a convenient route as often. Anyways, there's a lot of legal concepts involved. This is sort of public records, but also campaign and APOC regulations, and also some open meetings rules applied to social media.
And that was so we'll get back to on a more detailed answer for that, I guess. And then the last thing is, Open Meetings Act can still apply to social media. So this recently happened up in Palmer and made the news that officials commenting or being tagged in posts when it got to 4 people and they were discussing official business, it looked like an Open Meeting Act violation. So you have to be careful when you're acting in an official capacity online, even in the comments section. So nothing good happens in the comments section generally anyways. So I think that's a good rule of thumb. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Dean and let him discuss Open Meetings Act. Switch out.
So is that working? Oh, this is the right one. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hurt. That was an excellent presentation, and I hope that I can follow that act in an equally impressive manner. So anyways, now I'm going to talk about open meetings, and we like to call it government operating in sunshine. Right, and a lot of this is the same theme: it's transparency and openness for the public to be able to see what their government is doing. So there's Alaska State Statute Open Meetings Act is in 4462, 310 through 314, and there's the policy at 312. So courts use this policy when they apply the rules and have some issue or a case or challenge or complaint in court. This is what they apply to help their interpretation of the more specific provisions. The government units, they exist to aid the conduct of the people's business. The intent is that the deliberations of an elected body or board or commission be conducted openly, and the people of the state, they don't yield their sovereignty to the agencies that serve them. The people are still the overriding by governing body. So the people, well, what is good for the people to know, what is not good for them to know, that shouldn't be the right of a public servant. People's right to remain informed should be protected. And so these principles are what apply. And we have in subsection B here, this refers to 310C and D. Those are exceptions to requiring an open meeting under the Open Meetings Act. These relate to executive session and the types of situations that the Open Meetings Act does not apply. But subsection B says we construe these very narrowly. So sometimes we go, are we an exception? Do we have to notice a meeting and make it open, make arrangements? Will we have the clerk publishing and getting the room together and making sure it's staffed and all that? Do we have to go through all of that? Are we an exception? Whenever that question is there, we construe it narrowly. So we're often advising to err on the safe side, just publicly notice whatever our gathering is. So this substantive, I guess, sections rather than the policy sections of Open Meetings Act require all meetings of the state to be open to the public except as otherwise provided. And then they define the government body, assembly, public entity. So that includes, AWOOD, port, and some of our enterprise activities. Members of a subcommittee, this last part is important because it gets into some gray area, and it's often where we handle a lot of questions from the assembly. Subordinate unit that consists of 2 or more members. Now I mention this because we've had the case before where the assembly wants to assign 3 members or 2 to lead some task or subcommittee in a way with a working group. But if it's formed by the assembly in our meeting and the rules committee or so forth, it becomes a subordinate unit. And this is sort of contrasted with where, for example, one member just wants to develop legislation on their own and they go out and talk to another member. We have a common interest in this subject. Should we go ahead and work with some of the subject matter experts, the industry, to develop legislation? That's not a subordinate unit. It wasn't created from the body and from the governing body or the rules committee or so forth. So there's a little distinction there to understand, and that may affect whether it's subject to Open Meetings Act or not. So I guess this part is to say where we can be jealous because the Alaska State Legislature accepted themselves from the Open Meetings Act, while all the rest of us have to comply, with all the local governments throughout the state. So meetings means a gathering of members, and here's where we get 3 members or a majority. So if it's more than 3 members, a fourth of you shows up. That suddenly becomes a meeting of a governing body, but also where it's a matter where the body is empowered to act on.
I'm not the mathematician, but I think it's a third, not a fourth.
More than 3. So
4 would be 1/3 of 12, but Yeah, no, I'm sorry. He said a quarter, but
oh, sorry. When I said third, I didn't mean it as in a fractional sense. Excuse me, I said third, but then I'm backtracked and said fourth.
yeah,
But 3
it's all good.
can get together and anything. A majority here is 7 of you, and we're not concerned with that. But that becomes, I guess, an issue when it's a board or commission with 5 members, right? And 3 is the majority. And this says more than 3, and 3 would constitute a meeting for that number.
A specific example that gets confusing to people is the AMATS policy committee. So it's not a committee of the assembly, it's a joint committee between the state and the city or municipality, and it's a 5-member body. And so a quorum of that body is 3. And so 3 of those members can't be talking outside of an official meeting because they would constitute a meeting.
Yeah, that sort of relates to the serial meetings issue, and I have some slides on that a little bit later. Let's see. So next we have in our Anchorage Municipal Charter, so we also have a public meetings provision here in section 1705 in our home rule charter. It is a little bit different, and I wanted to point out a significant difference is this sentence that says at each such meeting, the public shall have reasonable opportunity to be heard. And the State Open Meetings Act, if you recall, is open to the public. It's not quite the same thing as a reasonable opportunity to be heard. And I think you will see, for example, all of our meetings have audience participation. We have public hearings on ordinances, which is important. The audience participation part is here, a reasonable opportunity to be heard at every meeting, even if you don't have a public hearing. Like every board or commission meeting has audience participation on its agenda. And then I'm going to get to a little nuance a little later.
I'll add that the word reasonable is the very interesting word in that sentence, because depending who you are and where you stand, that word has different meanings. And to some people, reasonable means at any time, whenever I want. And then some people, it means, well, it needs to be reasonable within the context of what we're doing. And it's very interesting to see how that word gets defined as you serve the public.
It's probably one of the most discussed terms in law school or jurisprudence is, what does reasonable mean? Is that right?
Yeah, somebody, Anna.
So I have a question, just so I know there's the formal regular meetings that have a set agenda and there is audience participation plus all the public hearings. And then there's committee meetings, which also have an agenda and typically have audience participation. And then there's work sessions, which I know, Chris, you had said do not necessarily have an agenda. They have a topic. So in this case, does this mean meeting anything that's been publicly noticed, or how? I guess I'm curious, like, where does that fall off?
Work sessions.
So, yeah, work sessions are a special creature and they're created by our code. So work sessions are covered by the Open Meetings Act. You know, you're ahead of me on my slides. I have this in there, but I don't mind talking about it now. It's a good time to bring it up. And I probably have too many slides for the time we have left. But work sessions are defined, and I'll jump to that definition, but they're not defined as meetings. And it's defined in context of our charter. We have regular meetings, special meetings, comedy meetings, informal meetings, and then work sessions. And it doesn't, and all the other definitions says it means a meeting of so and so. But work sessions are a gathering to get information. They're not called a meeting. And so we took this nuanced thing to say work sessions, as long as you're not deliberating among yourselves, you're not discussing your different viewpoints. Maybe you're asking questions and getting information, and that's it. Then we have advised that that's an exception here to that reasonable opportunity to be heard, because it's not technically a meeting under this context of our charter.
Okay, and I think I've heard that before, just watching work sessions, people will say, oh, this sounds like it's getting into deliberation. So that's the implication of it, that to say this is information.
Yes, and that is
Yes,
the
exactly right.
art of it,
And-
not the science. It's one of those things that you know it when you see it, but you can't really define it.
Exactly. And so in a work session, you're asking the presenter or whoever's brought a proposal forward. So why are we proposing this? Or subject matter experts will know what's the effect of this. But then you start to ask other members, so why do you think this is a good idea? Oh, you know, that's sort of drawing a line there. You don't want to get into that debate and deliberation part. And I wanted to make sure to mention something else here. Each such meeting, this applies to committees. And we have in our code that 3 minutes for public testimony is required at our regular meetings and special, but we don't have that time limitation for committees. We sort of apply it as a standard across the board. But as committee chairs, maybe you have limited time, you can say we're going to take audience participation and limit them to 2 minutes per person. You could 1 minute per person. I guess 30 seconds is stretching the reasonableness part of it. But, you know, applying the 3 minutes each is really kind of a boilerplate standard, and it's good to be consistent. Next, I have our code, and maybe I can skip down a little quicker here. And our code has definitions and defines sort of the time periods where the reasonable notice of an upcoming meeting must be provided. And these are all, I guess, have passed muster. So regular meetings, 36 hours, but you distribute the materials to members 72 hours prior. That's why we get them out for the addendum items Monday. Special meetings, 24 hours. Now, this is the time when the clerk publishes the notice. So it's not 24 hours when the chair or 5 members ask the clerk, can we have a special meeting 24 hours from now? No, you need to give the clerk and staff some time to put things together and make sure we can staff it. So, you know, think about maybe 48 hours for a special meeting so they can publish 24 hours before you actually got it.
Practically, I think it's about 4 hours, depending on the intensity of the agenda. If it's a 1-item agenda, they could probably get it drafted, reviewed, about 4 hours to get it published. But as Dean said, think 48 hours when you have 24 so that you can give them time to be human.
Sure. I'm a little more generous. Thank you. Come to informal meetings so you can read all of this sometime yourself. This is some exceptions under our code, and it also explains how the Board of Ethics is a board that accepts complaints about violations of our public meetings chapter or Open Meetings Act. But nothing's going to reduce the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. So our code or charter can be a little more restrictive or a little more have requirements that are more transparent, but we can't be less, I guess, have lesser requirements than the Open Meetings Act. And so I borrowed, of course, this is maybe a third iteration of PowerPoint on this topic, and I've borrowed some things from persons in the past. So here's a little test questions, and it's fashioned as some circus acts, because I think that's often what open meetings can be like. And so, excuse me. So here's a scenario to consider. The Open Meetings Act is designed to allow the public to watch board members deliberate. The Assembly just reorganized itself, secret voting and cloakroom discussions. So the chairs have revealed at the next meeting a new chair. Is that a chair or a chair?
One no.
But the rest of them, was that okay or not? Yeah, excellent. Yeah. You guys know your stuff, I think. So the open meeting does not apply to votes to organize a body, but only the votes are secret, not the rest. The deliberations, the discussion, the fact to make a motion to reorganize and elect a new chair, it's only the votes themselves. And I guess we didn't need to take a vote last Tuesday when we went through this action. But if we did, they would have been written and held privately by the clerk, and everything else would have been open to the public. So fast board meeting. Here's the scenario, and this uses school board meeting as an example. I'm sorry. Can I get my phone? Thank you. I'm just trying to watch the clock here, so 5 minutes left. The board notices an emergency meeting for Friday. So was that notice reasonable? Cheers or cheers? Oh, no. So it must be reasonable under the circumstances. So I think in this question, the circumstances didn't rise to what would be defined as an emergency, perhaps. So now some other situations, we do have emergency meetings in our code and charter that are allowed without notice. and
Dean, I have to
certain
interrupt.
requirements.
Didn't you say before, and isn't the practice that we could notice a special meeting in 24 hours?
Yeah, that's in our code and charter. So
Can I chime in here? So this specific scenario
of
was
course.
taken from a case here in Anchorage. I believe this was off the cuff, but the court's analysis, again, a lot of the stuff is case by case, and the court's analysis for this said because this position had so much responsibility that wasn't sufficient. Oh, there we go. He's got it. That wasn't sufficient notice. So yes, we can notice special meetings within 24 hours, but the court in this instance said that wasn't, 5 days weren't sufficient.
So that was a trick question, because in a general sense, the answer is yes, you could have a special meeting on general meetings, business, whatever, in 48 hours. 24 is our code, but there might be some exigent circumstance.
It's called job security.
So I'm going to just note that the analysis is always very case specific, case by case and circumstances. And if you look here, this case, I mean, Jessica's right. In 1980, when this Townley case was decided, 5 days wasn't enough time. I think we're in a different day and age where circumstances are very different. So maybe 24 hours would suffice. But, to give you credit there, I don't think that 24 hours has been challenged in court. Would it be upheld? I don't know. That's a good question. But we've been using it and we've continued to use it.
So one thing you haven't mentioned then is, okay, so you screw up. There was some decision that you could never understand the factors for that you should have known, I guess you couldn't meet in 24 hours, even though the code says you can. What's the cure? Because you had that meeting.
Well, there is remedial measures you can take to sort of correct. You can redo the public process for the meeting, the actions that were taken. That's one of the remedial measures to cure the situation. You know, until we get to that point, though, I think that the 24 hours is going to be okay to follow. So that's what I say. So, you know, we get questions about
The thing that he just kind of said that might not have been grasped, the cure for having an error in the open meetings process where you didn't do something that was to the necessary standard is to do it again. That's
Yes.
one. There are probably several others the attorneys can craft, but that's the one that we hear the most.
Yeah, there are a couple others listed here. We see. So I'm sort of trying to go through these quickly now since we're low on time. I already went through our work sessions contortion act. So the act doesn't separate work sessions, but our code does. So they should be noticed and they are and recorded and they are. But our charter, I just pointed out to this recently, so I'm going to skip through this. But here's the definition I refer to. Work session means a gathering, purpose of obtaining information. And so we avoid deliberating and sort of questioning each other, but you can question maybe the sponsor about why they're bringing it forward. It's so much matter experts about the content, the effect, and so forth. So I was getting into executive sessions, but seeing as I have 1 minute left, let me see. So this was using a scenario, sensitive personnel issue arises, there's a plan to save money, and the career employee objects to executive session. The board goes into a session anyway and discusses both issues. This was again sort of taking the context of a school board meeting. So is that jeers or cheers? Oh, and if you're not sure, that's fine, because I don't think that we looked at that section of the OMA closely. But the reasons you can go into executive session laid out in the Open Meetings Act are here. But subsection C2 is where I would point to, provided the person may request a public discussion. And so it's a person is involved and maybe their reputation, maybe their character, but they can request it to be open in the public. And there's case law on this, at least 2 or 3, and then from the Alaska Supreme Court. So I'm sorry, I need to update this slide. It's now 2:30 or 35 or 36. Excuse me. No, wait, I'm ahead of myself here. This needs to be updated. There's a different code section now, 2:30-36 about executive sessions, but much of this language is very much the same. So you can go in for labor negotiations and seize almost exactly like the Open Meetings Act. I'm sorry, the reputation and character of a person.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm remembering this from, I know it's different, but a board or a corporation there's also limits on executive session for those entities. But is it also true that there can't be action taken in executive session? So there can be things discussed, go into executive session, things are discussed, come out of executive session, and then any action that's taken still has to be on the record. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, there are some limited actions you can take. It's to give, I don't have the code section here in front of me, but to give direction to an attorney in a labor negotiation on a specific legal matter. And so if there is like case or something, you can do a motion on that. And then we've advised often that procedural motions, you know, so points of order or things like that, that aren't really taking substantive action, those are okay. If you want to extend the time for the meeting while you're in executive session, those are okay. After you exit executive session, it's sort of the duty of the chair to announce these were the things we did in executive session if there were motions and votes or action. Let's see. So permissible for only limited reasons. Well, this is getting a little repetitive, so I'm sorry, because of time I want to skip down, but it says so what. The important thing to remember is Open Meetings Act violations can provide a basis for a recall petition. And so it's happened before. This is a very old one. There are some more recent ones you're probably aware of. But you may recall that the Palmer City Council, they had some recall elections where I think 3 members, was it? they lost their seats. 4 members. Yeah, there were 4 that were in violation of Open Meetings Act, and then 3, I forget if all 4 went to recall. Well, I have a slide where there were 4 involved, but 3 lost their seats at the recall election. So, so assembly actions are not automatically void, but they are voidable. So even if you've sort of violated Open Meetings Act, it takes some action to avoid an act. And of course, you know, attorneys tend to be risk adverse, so we would always advise, you know, avoid any violations. Then you don't have that voidable shadow hanging over your head, where something can take effect, something can be acted on and avoid. I mean, possibly avoid some action by taking it to court, and just cause a lot of, I guess, angst, delays, and so forth, and getting some actions done. So a lawsuit has to be brought within 180 days. Then, if you're released to violate it, you can hold another meeting in compliance. You can conduct substantial public reconsideration of the matters considered the original meeting, or ways to cure. So if that can't happen, the court may do a balancing test. And I guess this is sort of important in some contexts. So I was recently reviewed for this, and there's the 2001, I think, reapportionment cases reviewed by the court said, yeah, the districting board violated the Open Meetings Act, but it's so important that we get this done, and it's such significant public interest to have the boundaries set and finalized that we're not going to invalidate the action because of that violation. So I would think that's a very rare exception where that would happen. This balancing test is generally going to fall in favor probably of avoiding things. And I'm sorry, can I continue on? I'm a little past our time. Yeah, I'll wrap up in 5 minutes, I hope. So here's the scenario: one-on-one conversations, discussing legislation and their own preferences, soliciting each other's advice. Later passes with little comment. So does that get cheers? I'm sorry, cheers. What do you guys think? Yes. So meetings every step of the deliberative decision-making process. I think a lot of this will depend on the one-on-one. I'm sorry. Oh, I thought a lot of this will depend on the circumstances. There are no one-on-one if 2 of you are talking to each other. But if you do one-on-one to one-on-one to one-on-one, and then you create a serial sort of meeting, that's where the danger is. So you would want to, I think, talk to, yeah, actually, here's that case I mentioned, soliciting each other's advice. Excuse me, I'm going to try to skip down though. 2 members talking about what they think is harmless, except how many did each of you talk to the other members about already? And so that's where, you know, 3 of you talked to each other, but if one of you talks to a 4th member and you share all that discussion, it becomes a serial meeting and a normal violation. And so that's where you want to be careful. And that's why we advise, you know, if there's 3 of you sponsoring legislation, you know, we'll keep it to that. Please don't talk to the other members about this, as the 3 of you work with council, the industry, or interested parties to develop the legislation. I tried to make some examples of alternatives. So there's a case law on this, and it's on my next slide. Brookwood Homeowners Association. A developer tried to invite a quorum of members to give a presentation to. That was a violation. But in the footnote, the court said, you know, the developer could invite members one by one and give the same presentation to all of them to lobby them for the development project they had. So that's okay. And you can do site visits, and we have done site visits, but the clerk can advise just publicly notice the site visits so you can all go together. You want to visit the navigation center site, maybe the Golden Lion coming up. You want to probably publicly notice it so you don't have to parse yourselves out to 3 or less, visiting one at a time. Those things are okay. And Brookwoods is what I mentioned, but I sort of want to skip down towards the end and land about the same topic where we did with public records. and social media. So all members received an email with information on an item for an upcoming meeting. Can I reply? I replied to one, not to all. And we get this all the time with members of the public sending something about something on the agenda coming up to the MAS assembly members, and you all get it. And please just reply to the sender and avoid replying to all. So all the 11 other members will get your response and see what you think and what you're saying about it. You want to avoid that. So just as best practice.
Jump in on that real quick. It seems absurd. It's hard to get the practice down, but not replying all is the way to go. Period. Full stop. It will protect you and everyone else. So do your best, and do your best. Nobody's perfect. The way our Outlook works, the reply button will be replaced with the reply all button by some automatic invisible feature, and you'll get into a habit because you just know, and then all of a sudden you look up and it replied all, not because you intended to, but because something changed in the code. And so beware, but reply all is not good.
Yeah, I have a question before we move on to the next slide. So I understand the no serial meetings. What about, for example, 3 of us are sponsoring an ordinance and then we're having a deliberation about what that needs to look like or whatever it is. And it's only 3, so not engaging with other members. And then let's say 2 other members separately from those sponsors are also talking about it, but don't interact with each other. I guess I'm trying to understand the limits and then also just the practicality of working through a draft without violating the OMA.
And that's a good example, though, if you're not interacting with each other, and we're not, I guess, using someone as an intermediary to pass what you all are saying to each other, then you're not going to be in violation of Open Meetings Act. And I think that probably happens a lot already, and that's okay. The important thing is when more than 3 of you start to discuss, you want it to be in an open meeting, right, to be transparent.
And the process by having the clerk share a communication to all the members is a workaround that we have developed. Whether it's been tested in a court, I don't know, but it's, when you get to a point with a project or you get a communication that you think everyone should have, send it to the clerk sends it out, everybody gets it, and it's part of the public record. So there's some protection there. Hard to say what a court would do in the specific question or the recall question, because he'll get into that now.
Yes. I think my last slide, I think it is, or next to last, is about chat rooms, and that relates to our social media discussion. This Palmer City of Palmer case, the conclusion, the description here is about 4 members. They all participated in Facebook chat discussion and maybe different points, but they were all making comments and sharing their thoughts on something that was going to come before Palmer City Council. And so the conclusion is written by Scott Brent Erickson, and I mentioned him because he's a well-known municipal attorney. He worked for the municipality of Anchorage in the 90s. Very knowledgeable, very smart. But he recommends city members not participate in communications by social media, email, or otherwise, where a quorum of council is included in the communication. I would replace that where 4 or more are included in the communication. And it's either discussing or being presented with information, deliberation upon matters which the council is going to act. So, and this did result in that recall election and 3 of them losing their seats. And with the interest of time, that's my last slide.
And something that some of us learned through the pandemic is they could recall you for accidentally belching on the dais. It's up to the voters. The courts are going to say the voters get to decide. And so you have to weigh the calculus of all of these things against that. But we as a body have been studious about not doing serial meetings, keeping working groups tight, and members from previous assemblies they don't believe it. Like, there's no way you do this work in this way. And that's because, of course, at those times they weren't in compliance. In my opinion, that's what the evidence points to. But the fact is, with trust and long-term relationships and communication in meetings that are open, lots can get done. All right. So anyone else? Dean?
I would just like to add, all of this is easier said than done. I mean, you all are very accomplished individuals and elected public officials. You want to be proactive and work for the good of the public and your constituents. everything, so you don't want to be sort of suddenly restrained from talking about things. But that's what this does. So do your best. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll just take a couple minutes, reset the tables, and this work session is